Hello, and welcome to the Come to Your Senses podcast. I'm your host, embodiment-based coach, Mary Lofgren. Here, we explore how to live bravely and beautifully through a lifestyle of embodiment. You'll hear gems to empower you around mindset, mindfulness, somatic psychology, and neuroscience, as well as beauty, food, style, and the art of slow living to meet your soul through the senses. I am so happy that you're here. Let's begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Come to Your Senses. Welcome to today's episode that is part 2 in a series all about how to seduce yourself into a new habit. As the seasons start to change here in the Northern Hemisphere towards the energy of spring, it's very natural that new habits, new ideas, and new ways of being would start to come into your consciousness. And as I said in last week's episode, which was the first part in this series, it's also really common for self-doubt and inconsistency and why even bother, or the flip side of that, which is I'm going to now make this new habit or new way of being the entire center of my life. And both of these approaches tend to be unsustainable. And what is more sustainable, in my experience, is the energy of seduction. So if you're new to my work, very long story short, a big piece of how my work originated was I wrote a book called Sacred Seduction as my former burlesque persona, Kitty Cavalier. And for many years, really studied the nature of attraction in action and the way in which desire has its own timeline and magnetism, and where when we choose to pursue a desire, it's not just the thing that we're after, but it's how that desire reconstructs who we are in the process. So in some ways, we're wed to the desire itself, not just the outcome. And in last week's episode, we talked about the first step in any awareness or acquisition of what you want, which is getting clear on what you don't want and how to clear space in your mind, your body, your heart, and your life to even entertain the thought of a new habit. And I shared with you a bit about my own experience having a history of addiction recovery and also using those principles of addiction recovery to navigate something I've been doing lately, which is reduced time on my phone. I deleted some apps off of my phone, and I've been exploring, this phone that takes up so much of my time, so much of my attention, and is really actually stealing from my other desires, my deeper desires. I'm really curious about who actually is under there in the 4 to sometimes 6 hours a day that I was spending on my phone. And so in the previous episode, I talked about the detoxification from what I don't want. And today I'm going to be sharing with you some of the experiences that I've learned in how to seduce not just what I want, but seduce myself into the process of a new habit. So changing a habit can sometimes feel like going on a diet, totally unsustainable and just brutal in its nature. And there's a fabulous quote from Louis Schwartzberg who says, "Beauty and seduction are nature's tools for survival, because we will protect what we fall in love with." And so let's dive into our gems on how to fall in love with a new habit. So the first gem is just about seduction in general. And what is seduction? How do you relate to seduction? So I have a whole catalog of episodes on this topic that I'll drop a few in the show notes if you want to study it further. But essentially, when we look at the old paradigm of seduction, the more common understanding of seduction, there's a quality of over-sexualization and a method of manipulation. And how I define seduction is simply attraction in action. Seduction, when I am seduced by something, I am not just living in the fantasy of the desire, but I'm actually willing to be vulnerable and take action on that desire. And I feel led, not just by, again, the outcome that I want to see, but by who I am becoming in the process of making myself vulnerable to this desire. I remember when I first started researching seduction was on the dance floor. And I was in a dance class and I would see this person every week, and sometimes they would dance with me and sometimes they wouldn't. And I was disturbed by how personally I took it when they wouldn't dance with me and how I would obsess about it. And so I started broadening and widening my field of seduction, where a successful seduction would not be getting this person to do something I wanted them to do, because that's really ultimately out of my control. But where a successful seduction was going and showing up and having fun and being myself and enjoying the process. And so seduction became less about making something happen and more about me seducing myself with the experience, which of course then becomes very magnetic and attractive. So nothing ever happened. I mean, I learned so much. Honestly, that experience on the dance floor gave birth to a whole body of work within myself. And nothing ever really happened with that dancer that I desired to dance with and get to know. But I certainly got what I wanted and needed from the experience. And that, I think, is another distinction, is that this more manipulative mind game, control the outcome kind of seduction is kind of like, I don't know, the other day I was talking to a friend and she was talking about how she recently broke up with someone that she had been dating for a while, but he just, when he showed his true colors, he was not available, and she really wants something long-term and committed. And I said, "Get out of here, decoy." And thinking about like a wooden decoy duck, and she said, "God, that's so true. Like, I don't want the decoy. I want what's real." And so sacred seduction, the kind of seduction we're talking about today and that I practice, is very, very rooted in what's real. And honesty and vulnerability, revealing oneself and surrendering to what comes in that process, as opposed to editing and censoring oneself in an attempt to control. And so that's just to lay the groundwork of when we talk about seducing our way into new habits and new ways of being, what we're really talking about. And this more surrendered kind of seduction is really an ecosystem. It's not just this one part of ourselves that we choose to show or we choose to work on. And similarly, habits are also an ecosystem. So in my coaching programs, I sometimes teach a class called Bravely and Beautifully, a feminine approach to goal setting. And in that class, we talk about how goal setting tends to be perceived as like this comet of energy that needs to just propel itself forward. And if you want it bad enough, and if you work hard enough, then you'll get your goal. And that in this more feminine way of being, we instead look at it as a constellation where there are so many different layers and so many different components that go into the creation of a goal, including having a deep sense of purpose. Feminine-oriented beings and this energy that we call feminine in ourselves and in the world tend to be more driven by things like community and connection and emotion and purposeful change and benefit in the world than they are simply the acquisition of resources or, the victory that one feels when one sees a goal start to happen. And so that comes to our next gem, which is that anything that you do has a purpose. And as Coach Tanya Lee likes to say, you don't have to love what you want, but you do have to love why you want it. And so when you are seducing yourself into a new habit or a new way of being, an exercise that might be useful is an exercise called the 5 whys. And in coaching, this is kind of a problem-solving exercise where something might be breaking down or not working in your life or in a company, and you'll sit down and trace the question, well, why isn't this working? Well, why isn't that working? All the way back to just kind of the origin or the root of the issue for more effective problem solving. And you can also do this in a kind of pleasure spiral where you're going deeper and deeper into the deep want. So maybe it's not just the deep why, but it's the deep want. So when I think about my recent escapade into reducing my use of my phone, I really wanted, I know what screen time does to my eyeballs and to my sleep and, all these reasons why I shouldn't be on my phone. But should is never a strong enough motivator to actually inspire long-term change. And so that could be another useful exercise, is areas where you want to create change, but where you feel like it's not happening or it's not sustainable. Where is should coming into that equation? And so those were kind of my surface reasons, is like, this makes me feel like shit. But the deeper reasons, when I got down to some of the deeper reasons, it's like, well, why don't I want to feel like shit? And it's like, well, because this is my life. This is my life force. And after doing this exercise and going down deeper and deeper and deeper, I realized that there were whole parts of my brain and being that were being anesthetized by this device, and that I was in a loop of compulsion. And when a loop of compulsion is at play, there needs to be a pretty, in my experience, dramatic initial period in order to break that loop. And so that's kind of what the entire last episode is about, is when you stop doing something that you've been doing to cope or to get by for many years, there's going to be some backlash on the inner world. And there's going to be lots and lots of really creative reasons that the mind thinks of as to why you will die without this thing. And in those moments, when it does become life or death, there has to be a deep, deep motivator in order to keep that commitment. We're talking some Joan of Arc shit here, people. You got to be really in and really committed. And commitment, I think that, again, the old paradigm of commitment is like the willpower to resist temptation. I feel tense and exhausted just hearing those words. But this newer paradigm that we're talking about today is purpose creates such a deep river of seduction that instead of trying to push away these decoys or these temptations, you're instead just simply being led by the depth of your own desire. And so this can be really deep work, and something that can be helpful is writing it down and just writing down 5 whys, 5, statements of the question why. Writing your desire at the top. Why do you want that? Surface reason. Well, why do you want that? Next reason. All the way until you feel something deep in your body. And there is a recognition of truth meeting nerve. And then from there, we move on to the next question. And, these questions, what, why, how, are really important and often very disorganized when it comes to creating a new habit or creating a goal. Usually, the fixation is simply on the how. You might get frustrated or you might have a desire and leap immediately to the how. And without the motivation of the why, you're really going to burn out pretty quickly. But another question that's really important to ask is, in between the why and the how is the what. And so this gem is about illustrating the vision of what it is that this new habit or new way of being is going to create in your life, and fall in love with that. So when I think of my desire to be on my phone less, I had this deep desire to feel my creativity come alive in ways that it simply can't when I'm on my phone. And also to feel a depth of intimacy in my relationships. Creativity and connection are 2 of my core values. And I knew that being phone drunk was really keeping me from being able to show up. And, just as a side note, the most amazing things are happening that I'm always so delighted and surprised by every time I make a big shift like this in my life, which is that there are parts of frozen tissue in my brain that are literally waking up like spring snowdrops. And ultimately, the greater vision is not just being able to be more intimate and being able to be more creative, but, it's that purposeful, authentic life that feels like my own, that is really at the heart of every desire that I have. If it's the car I want to drive, if it's the country I want to live in, it's like that discovery of the truth of my soul through following my desires and to become the woman that I want to be and how I should want to show up in the world. So when I thought about my vision of myself not addicted to my phone, I would imagine a woman who has a peace of mind that is simply not accessible to me when I'm in that haze of electronics. I would have 4 hours of my day back. So I would have a more clean, serene, peaceful home. And this was the kicker, is at nighttime. I talked about this in the previous episode also, that when I use my phone the most is at night to cope with feelings of lonesomeness and living alone and wanting connection, but not having any in-person connection. So going for that faux connection that social media creates. And I just envisioned myself feeling so at home and so at peace and so luxuriating in my evenings. And man, do I respect that version of myself who is so congruent with who she says she wants to be and how she shows up in the world. And once again, if our habits are an ecosystem, and I see this version of myself who's luxuriating in solitude in her evenings, there are other areas of her life that are thriving and flourishing as a result of the reclamation of her time, her energy, and her life force. And that, my friends, is something I can get behind. That vision, the purpose, the why that we talked about is a really concrete reason. But I lust and salivate after living into the experience of that vision. Like, that is very attractive and seductive to me. And just thinking about it generates feelings in my body that feel like peace and contentment, luxuriousness, congruence, self-respect. And damn, those feel good. I mean, I can feel them right now. And this is a really important part of the what. It's not just thinking about it in the context of someday I'll have the brass ring of those feelings, or someday I'll get the cookie if I just work hard enough. But not waiting to feel those things, inviting those things into your body now, just like you might envision yourself eating an apple. And as I say that, if you imagine the crisp bite and the way that the juice tickles your tongue, maybe the tartness sweetens in your mouth, like you can start having a glimmer of the experience of what it's like to eat an apple. And similarly, with holding this vision, you can start to feel those feelings now, which provides an even deeper sense of seduction, moving you forward on your path. And that brings us to our final question, which is a little bit more of the how. It's a little bit more of the strategy of the whole thing. And I'm actually going to stop here. So I plan to make this a 2-part series, but that's a big question. And I think I could devote a whole 20 minutes to talking about those gems. So we're going to make this a full-blown masterclass, my friends. And I invite you to sit with and savor these exercises of your deep why, and then holding your vision and feeling those feelings. And I'd love to hear what you notice. You can always send us an email at hello@schoolofsensualliving.com, or leave us a review and share with me what you're noticing from these practices, because it's powerful, and it's really powerful for me to hear how this is landing for you and what you're noticing. So feel free to share that with us. And then next week, we'll talk a little bit about how to take those feelings and bring them into form with your actions. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you in our next episode. For coaching, classes, and community in creating a lifestyle of embodiment, head to schoolofsensualliving.com. There you'll find a free video series on how to reduce anxiety and intercept the stress response through powerful, confident body language. Head to schoolofsensualliving.com/confidence to watch your first video